He did not even look back. That was the part that broke her. Not the cold, not the empty platform stretching out in every direction like the edge of the world. Not even the fact that every cent she had left in this life had gone toward a train ticket to reach a man she had never met. A man who had written her letters that smelled faintly of cedar and made promises with the careful penmanship of someone who understood what a desperate woman needed to hear. What broke Evelyn Hartwell was the way the station master looked at her when she asked, for the third time, whether perhaps the telegram had been delayed. And he looked at her the way men look at something they have already decided isn't their problem. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "That man's not coming." Lily made a small sound against her neck. 2 years old and already she could feel it, the way the air changes when safety disappears. If you have ever stood somewhere and realized the ground beneath you was never as solid as you believed, then you already know how Evelyn felt in that moment. And if you haven't, stay with me. Because what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about who gets to survive and who gets left behind. Subscribe now and follow this story to the very end, because the next chapters will leave you breathless. Hit like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story has traveled. The letter had arrived on a Thursday in late October, which Evelyn would later think was fitting, because Thursday was the kind of day that didn't belong to anything. Not the hope of the beginning of the week, not the relief of the end. Just a plain gray day when a plain gray envelope appeared beneath the door of the room she rented from Mrs. Albrecht on Farnsworth Street in Boston, and changed the direction of everything. She had been awake since before dawn. Lily was cutting another tooth and had spent most of the night working herself into a fury that no amount of rocking or humming could settle. And by 4 in the morning, Evelyn had given up on sleep and sat in the chair beside the window with the baby against her chest, watching the city go dark and then slowly, reluctantly, go gray again. She was 26 years old, and she was so tired that the tiredness had stopped feeling like a physical thing and had become simply the atmosphere she lived inside of, something she breathed in and breathed out without thinking about it anymore. The letter was from a man named Gerald Fitch. He had found her name through a matrimonial correspondence agency, the kind that advertised discreetly in the back pages of certain newspapers, the kind that women in Evelyn's position read with a mixture of shame and desperate hope. He was 41, he wrote, a rancher in Silver Creek, Montana Territory, widowed 3 years prior, with a property of moderate size and the means to provide a stable home for a woman of good character. He was not, he made clear, looking for romance. He was looking for a capable partner, someone to manage the household, someone practical. He did not say anything about children. Evelyn had written back anyway. She told him about Lily. She told him plainly, in the direct way she had learned to write after her husband Thomas died of a fever 2 winters ago, and she had discovered that the world offers very little patience to women who cannot afford to be indirect. She told Gerald Fitch that she had a daughter, age 1, and that the daughter was healthy and quiet and would not be a burden, and that she herself was capable of hard work, had managed accounts for her father's dry goods business before her marriage, could cook and sew and keep records, and would make him a reliable and honest wife. She did not say that she was afraid. She did not say that the room on Farnsworth Street cost more than she earned taking in mending, and that Mrs. Albrecht had already spoken to her twice about the rent, and that the coming winter felt like a wall she could not see over. She did not say any of that because Gerald Fitch had not asked about her fears. He had asked about her character. He wrote back in 2 weeks. He accepted her. He would send train fare. She should arrive before the hard freeze. That was all. There was no warmth in the letter, no particular cruelty either. It read like a business arrangement, and Evelyn told herself that was fine, that was good even. She had been in love once, with Thomas, and Thomas was gone, and love had not protected her from anything that had come after. A business arrangement was something she could work with. A business arrangement had terms she could understand. She packed everything she owned into one large bag and a smaller one, sold the pieces of furniture that weren't Mrs. Albrecht's, gave away the things she couldn't carry, and on the 14th of November she boarded the westbound train with Lily strapped against her body with a length of cloth and the smaller bag on her shoulder and the larger one checked below. And she did not look back at Boston because she had learned by then that looking back was a thing that cost you more than it gave. The journey took 11 days. 11 days of coal smoke and rattling windows, and Lily sleeping in fitful intervals and waking to cry and being soothed and falling asleep again. 11 days of hard seats and the particular smell of too many people in an enclosed space. 11 days of watching the landscape outside the window transform from the dense, familiar architecture of the East into something increasingly open and stark and indifferent. Rolling plains where the sky sat low and heavy, river valleys cutting through treeless hills, and finally the jagged dark line of mountains on the horizon that Evelyn had never seen before and that made her chest tighten with something she couldn't name. The other passengers changed at every stop. A family of Germans going to homestead somewhere in the Dakota Territory. A pair of young men heading to the silver mines with the bright-eyed certainty of people who have not yet learned what certainty costs. A woman about Evelyn's age traveling alone who said nothing and stared out the window for 2 days straight and got off at a station whose name Evelyn never caught. No one asked Evelyn where she was going. No one asked about Lily. That was fine. On the morning of the 11th day, the train pulled into Silver Creek Station, and Evelyn stepped onto the platform, and the cold hit her like a door swinging open onto a room that had been empty for a very long time. It was the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself gradually. It was already there, complete, waiting. Not the wet chill of a Boston winter, but something drier and more absolute, a cold with an edge to it, like a blade that had been left outside overnight. Lily whimpered and burrowed deeper against Evelyn's chest, and Evelyn wrapped both arms around her and looked down the platform. There was no one. The platform was a wooden structure, weathered and uneven, extending about 30 feet in either direction from the station house. A man in a railroad uniform came out, took a single look at Evelyn, noted the bag at her feet and the child against her chest, and disappeared back inside. A wagon sat empty and hitched to a patient horse at the far end, but no one came to claim it. 2 men in heavy coats walked past without looking at her. A dog sat near the station house door, watching her with the calm, measuring gaze of an animal that has seen many things arrive on trains and knows better than to get attached. Evelyn waited. She told herself that Gerald Fitch was simply delayed. The roads would be difficult in this weather. He had not anticipated the exact timing. He would come. She had his letter in her coat pocket. She had put it there this morning specifically so she could pull it out and read the address again if she needed to. Silver Creek Station, November. I will send someone to meet you if I cannot come myself. And she had not needed to read it because she had memorized it, but she touched the pocket anyway, feeling the edge of the folded paper through the wool. She waited for 20 minutes. Then she went inside the station house. The station master was a broad man with a red beard going gray and the particular expression of someone who has been asked too many questions by too many strangers passing through a place they didn't understand. He looked up when she came in, glanced at Lily, looked back at Evelyn. Help you? I'm looking for Gerald Fitch, Evelyn said. He was to meet me here. He's a rancher, has a property. I know who Gerald Fitch is. The station master's tone didn't change. He's not here. I can see that. Do you know when he might? Ma'am. He set down his pen. Gerald Fitch left Silver Creek 6 weeks ago, sold his ranch and headed south. Texas, somebody said. Or maybe California. Nobody knows exactly. A pause. You come all the way from back east? The words took a moment to arrange themselves into something she could understand. Sold his ranch. Left 6 weeks ago. She stopped. Started again. He sent me a train ticket. He wrote to say he would meet me here. The station master looked at her with an expression that was almost sympathy, but had a floor under it. A limit, a boundary she could feel without being able to see it clearly. I'm sorry, he said, and he sounded like he meant it a little. I don't know anything about that. But he's gone. Evelyn stood there for a moment in the warm, coal-smelling interior of the station house and tried to calculate what she was standing inside of. Gerald Fitch had purchased her train ticket. He had sent it to her through the agency. He had told her to come before the hard freeze. And then, at some point in the 6 weeks before she arrived, he had simply left, sold everything, gone south. He had left her the ticket. He had not left her anything else. He had not notified the agency. He had not written to tell her not to come. Perhaps he had simply forgotten. Perhaps something had happened. Perhaps he had never intended to do it differently. It didn't matter, she realized. The outcome was the same either way. She was standing in a train station in Silver Creek, Montana Territory, in November, with $11.43 to her name and a 2-year-old daughter who had started to shiver against her chest, and there was no Gerald Fitch, and there was no ranch, and there was nowhere to go. Is there a... Her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. Is there a boarding house, or somewhere I might... Pearson's, the station master said, and then paused in a way that told her something. It's not cheap. How much? He told her. She did the arithmetic quickly, the way she had learned to do it, without feeling, without hesitation, just numbers. At that rate, she had enough for 4 nights, maybe 5 if she was careful about meals. After that, nothing. Thank you, she said. She went back outside. The cold came back immediately, without apology. Lily had stopped shivering and gone very still in that way she sometimes did when she was overwhelmed. Not calm, but shut down, her small body conserving itself. Evelyn pulled her closer and stood on the platform and looked out at Silver Creek. It was not a large town. A main street with perhaps 24 storefronts, half of them dark. A church. A livery stable from the sound and smell of it. A saloon with light leaking under the door. Mountains in the middle distance, and above them a sky that was the color of an old bruise, heavy with weather that hadn't arrived yet but was coming. She could feel it in the way the air had changed in the last 20 minutes, something gathering. She picked up her bag. She had taken perhaps 10 steps when she heard the horse. It came fast. Not panicked, not out of control, but fast in the way a working animal moves when it has a destination and a rider who knows what he's doing. She stepped back automatically, pulling Lily tighter, and the horse, a bay, big and dark with steam coming off its flanks, came around the corner of the station house and pulled up short about 15 feet away, and the man on its back looked down at her. He was not what she expected. She hadn't been expecting anyone, so that wasn't exactly the right way to put it, but there was something about the way he sat the horse, not performing anything, not arranging himself, that caught her attention. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, with a face that looked like it had been outdoors most of those years. Dark coat, worn but good quality. Hat pulled low. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not unfriendly, but assessing, like he was calculating something. "You the woman waiting for Gerald Fitch?" he asked. She looked at him. Was it that obvious? There aren't many women standing alone on the platform with everything they own and a baby in the middle of November, he said. Word gets around fast in a small town. Ed in there. He nodded toward the station house. Mentioned you to Sam Pryor, who mentioned it to me. I was coming in to post a letter anyway. He swung down from the horse in one motion that suggested he'd done it about 10,000 times. Caleb Dawson. Evelyn Hartwell. He looked at Lily. How old? 2. Almost. He nodded slowly, like he was doing the same arithmetic she had been doing. Where are you planning to go? Pearson's boarding house, she said. For now. For now. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The wind picked up and Lily made a sound of protest and Evelyn shifted her, adjusted the cloth, tried to get her face out of the wind. Her own hands were going numb. She hadn't brought gloves adequate for this. The gloves she'd owned adequate for Boston winters turned out to be dramatically insufficient for whatever a Montana November planned to offer. Caleb Dawson reached into his coat and pulled out a pair of heavy work gloves. He held them out. I don't need, she started. Your hands are going to freeze before you get to Pearson's, he said. Not unkindly, just factually. She took the gloves. They were too large and smelled of horse and leather and something faintly like wood smoke, and she pulled them on anyway and felt the immediate, almost embarrassing relief of having her hands stop hurting. Gerald Fitch, Caleb said. He wasn't asking. He was just saying the name like he was testing it, seeing what it produced. He sent me a ticket, Evelyn said, 3 weeks ago. I was to come before the hard freeze and he would meet me, and you didn't hear from him after that. No. Caleb looked out at the street. He had a way of looking at things, not distracted, not avoiding her, but like he was actually looking, processing. Fitch was never a man people here trusted much, he said after a moment. He talked a good game, wrote a good letter, I imagine. Evelyn said nothing. He left in October, Caleb continued. There were debts, some of them legal and some of them less so. He wasn't the type to face a thing head on if there was a direction he could go instead. He paused. I'm sorry he brought you out here under false pretenses. He didn't hold a gun to my head, Evelyn said. She heard the edge in her own voice and was too tired to smooth it. I made a choice. Sure, Caleb said. People make choices with the information they have. He looked at Lily again, really looked, the way not many people did, with actual attention. She's cold. She's fine. She's cold, he said again, and it wasn't an argument, just an observation, delivered without pressure, but also without the option of being ignored. He unbuttoned his coat, a long, heavy thing, buffalo hide lined with something dark, and held it open. Here, put this around both of you. Mr. Dawson, it's not a charitable act, he said. It's practical. If she gets sick out here, you're going to have a much harder problem than you already have. The coat's warm, take it. She took it. He helped her arrange it, around her shoulders, pulled forward to cover Lily as well, and it was so warm that she felt her eyes sting unexpectedly, which mortified her. She turned her face away slightly and swallowed and got herself back together. Thank you, she said. It's a coat, he said. They stood there for a moment in a silence that was not quite comfortable but was not hostile either. Black River Ranch, Caleb said then. You know it? I don't know anything here, she said. It's 8 miles out. Thomas Brigg owns it. Owned it, I should say. He passed last spring. His son Nathaniel is the heir, but he's back east dealing with the estate, and the ranch is being run by myself and the hands in the meantime. He paused. We're short a person to manage the house. The woman who did it before left in September to go be near her sister in Oregon. We've been making do, but... He stopped, seemed to reconsider something. It's not elegant work. It's early mornings and hard days in a house full of men who don't pick up after themselves. Evelyn looked at him. I'm offering you a job, he said. Room and board included. It's not much beyond that, not while the estate is unsettled, but it's shelter and food and a place to be while you figure out what comes next. Why, she said. He seemed to find the question reasonable. He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated. She hated when people answered too quickly, like they hadn't actually considered it. Because someone has to do the work, he said finally. And you're clearly capable of something, or you wouldn't have made it out here in the first place. And because leaving a woman and a child to manage on $11 in November in Montana is the kind of thing I'd rather not do. He shrugged. Also, the coat situation is going to become a problem. She almost laughed. She didn't. It wasn't quite there yet, but she came close. I can cook, she said. I can keep accounts. I can manage a household. That's what I need. I don't know anything about ranch work. I've never been on a horse. I'm not asking you to work cattle. The men, she said, some of them won't want a woman there. Some of them won't, he agreed. That's their business to manage. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes without any particular performance. No attempt to reassure her more than he had. No obvious agenda she could detect. He was not handsome in the way that men in novels were handsome, and he was not charming in the way that men with something to sell were charming. He was just a man standing in the cold, offering her a coat that was too big and a job she hadn't asked for, and waiting to see what she decided. Lily shifted against her chest and made a small, complaining sound. All right, Evelyn said. He nodded once, like she had confirmed something he'd already been fairly confident about. I'll get the wagon. The ride to Black River Ranch took over an hour, and Caleb drove it in the same way he seemed to do most things, without excess, without performance. He asked her 1 or 2 questions about the journey, answered 1 or 2 of hers about the ranch, and otherwise let the silence be what it was. Lily fell asleep inside the coat, her small body finally warming, and Evelyn held her and watched the landscape and tried to decide how she felt about what she had just agreed to. Afraid, she decided, but afraid in a different way than she had been on the platform. On the platform, it had been the fear of having no direction, like standing in the center of a room where every door had just been removed. This was different. This was the fear that comes when you have a direction, when you've made a choice, when the thing ahead of you is at least real enough to be frightening in a specific rather than a general way. She could work with specific fears. She had learned that about herself. The ranch came into view just as the light was failing. A cluster of buildings around a main house that was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories, wood-sided, with a long porch running across the front and a barn to the east and various outbuildings scattered beyond. There were lamps lit in the lower windows, and smoke coming from two chimneys, and horses in the pen beside the barn, and the general organized impression of a place that had been built to function and had been functioning for some time. Caleb drove the wagon around to the back of the house, the working entrance, she understood, and pulled up beside the door. He got down and came around to help her, and she noted that he didn't try to take Lily, just offered a hand for her to step down with, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. The door opened before they reached it. The man standing in the doorway was perhaps 45, thick through the chest and arms, with a mustache that had been trimmed with some care and eyes that were doing rapid calculations. He looked at Caleb first, then at Evelyn, then at the child in her arms, then back at Caleb. "Huh," he said. "This is Evelyn Hartwell," Caleb said. "She'll be taking over the house. Frank, this is Frank Aller. He manages the hands." Frank Aller looked at her for another moment. "You know what you're walking into, ma'am?" "No," Evelyn said honestly, "but I'm here anyway." He seemed to find that acceptable. He stepped back from the doorway. "Coffee's on," he said. "House is a mess. We've been eating whatever anyone could figure out, and it's been—" He trailed off. "Well, come in." She came in. The kitchen was large and functional, and clearly had not been managed by anyone with any organizational system in 2 months. There were dishes that had been washed and stacked incorrectly so they couldn't stack properly. There were supplies on the wrong shelves. There was a calendar on the wall that hadn't been turned since August. There were 3 pairs of boots by the door when there should have been a boot rack, and the boot rack was across the room holding a saddle. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at it all and felt, beneath the exhaustion and the fear and the residual cold still working its way out of her bones, something else. Something that was almost like recognition. This was a problem she understood. This was a problem she knew how to approach. "Hot water?" she asked Frank Oler. "Pump's right there. I'm going to need to get the baby settled, and then I'll need to understand what food is here and what the men need for breakfast tomorrow." Frank blinked. "Breakfast isn't until 6. "I know," she said. "That gives me time." She was aware of Caleb behind her, not watching her exactly, but present, in the way you're aware of someone who is paying attention without making a show of it. She didn't look at him. She carried Lily to the small room off the kitchen that Frank showed her. A housekeeper's room, barely large enough for a cot and a chair, but dry and warm and private. And she laid the sleeping baby down on the cot and arranged the coat around her and stood there for a moment in the small room, looking at her daughter's face. Lily slept the way she always slept, completely, unreservedly, with the total confidence of a child who does not yet understand that the world might not be safe. Her eyelashes were dark against her cheeks. Her hands were curled loosely on the coat. Evelyn touched her hair once, very gently. Then she went back to the kitchen. The fire in the stove was good. Someone had managed that much at least. She found the coffee pot and poured a cup and drank half of it standing over the stove, and then set it down and started to take stock. Frank was still there, watching her from the doorway with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of cautious optimism. "You eaten?" he asked. "On the train. That was probably hours ago. I'll eat when I've figured out what's here. There's biscuits from this morning. They're not—" "Thank you, Frank." He went away. Caleb had already gone. She heard the wagon moving, the horse being taken to the barn. She was alone in the kitchen, which was what she needed. She opened the pantry and assessed what was there with the same focused attention she had applied to every practical problem she had ever faced. What do I have? What do I need? What's the gap? And what can I do tonight versus what has to wait until tomorrow? The pantry was better stocked than the kitchen suggested. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, a good quantity of potatoes, dried apples, several jars of preserved vegetables that someone had put up with care. Enough to work with, more than enough, if she was organized about it. She started the biscuits for morning, not because she had to, the men would have managed something, but because doing it now, doing it right, was how she was going to establish what kind of person she was in this place. Not through announcement, not through argument, through the biscuits being on the table at 6 o'clock, the coffee being hot, the kitchen being organized enough to work in. That was how she had always worked, quietly and precisely, and in ways that couldn't be argued with. The kitchen was warmer than any place she'd been in the last 11 days, and Lily was sleeping 20 feet away. And outside the Montana wind had picked up and was moving against the house in long waves that she could hear but not feel. She worked at the table in the lamplight and thought about Gerald Fitch somewhere in Texas or California, and she thought about Thomas in the ground in Boston, and she thought about her father's dry goods store that she had kept the books for from the time she was 14 years old. She did not think about what would happen if this didn't work. She didn't have enough information yet to be afraid of the right things, and being afraid of the wrong things was a waste of resources she couldn't spare. The dough came together well. She shaped the biscuits and set them to rest and turned to the question of breakfast. And she was deep in that calculation when the back door opened and two men came in, stamping snow off their boots and stopping when they saw her. They were young, mid-20s at most, trail-worn, with the unsettled look of men who hadn't expected to find a woman in the kitchen. "Who are you?" the taller one said. "Not rude exactly, just unprepared." "Evelyn Hartwell," she said. "I'll be managing the house. Breakfast is at 6. There's coffee." They looked at each other. The shorter one had a cut on his forearm that was roughly bandaged with something inadequate. "That needs to be properly cleaned," she said, nodding at it. He looked down at his arm. "It's fine." "It's not infected yet," she said, which is different from fine. "Sit down. I'll deal with it after the biscuits are in." The taller one, she would learn his name was Pete, watched her for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating something. Then he sat down too, because the coffee was there, and the kitchen was warm and she hadn't given him a reason to leave. She went back to her biscuits. Outside, the wind moved against the house again, and somewhere a shutter that hadn't been properly latched knocked twice and then held. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow there were 100 things to learn and 100 mistakes to make and 100 judgments to endure from men who didn't think she'd last the month. She already knew most of them were going to be wrong about her. She had known since she was standing on that platform in the cold, holding her daughter, watching the last of what she had planned fall apart, and deciding, not with hope, not with optimism, but with the specific, clear-eyed determination of someone who has already lost the things she feared losing, that she was going to build something here. Not for Gerald Fitch, not for any man. For Lily, sleeping in the small room off the kitchen with the big warm coat around her, trusting completely in the safety of a place she had never been before and didn't understand yet. That trust was not something Evelyn was going to disappoint. Not now, not here, not ever. She put the biscuits in the oven and cleaned the shorter ranch hands cut with water and a clean cloth she found in the second drawer, and he winced and didn't complain, and Pete filled his own coffee and then, without being asked, found a rag and started wiping down the counter on the other side of the kitchen. She noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. That was the first night at Black River Ranch. Not triumphant, not clean, just the specific, unglamorous work of building a foothold in a place that hadn't expected her, done quietly and precisely, while the Montana wind moved against the walls, and her daughter slept 20 feet away, and the biscuits rose slowly in the oven. She had come west looking for a husband who would protect her. She was beginning to understand that protection was not what she needed. What she needed was ground, and she was going to make it herself. The biscuits were gone by 6:15. That was the first thing she understood about Black River Ranch. Not the cold, not the distance from anything she had known before, not even the particular way the men moved around her in those first days, like she was a piece of furniture that had been placed in an unexpected location and everyone was still deciding whether it belonged there. The first real thing she understood was the appetite. These men ate the way the land demanded of them, completely, without ceremony, and with the focused efficiency of people who understood that the body was a working tool and needed to be maintained like one. She had made 4 dozen biscuits before dawn. She had been certain that was too many. Pete came back for his third one before the others had finished their first, and he had the grace to look slightly embarrassed about it. "They're good," he said, as if that explained something. "There's more coffee," she told him, because she had already learned that Pete communicated primarily through appetite, and that a compliment from him was worth acknowledging but not dwelling on. The other men introduced themselves in pieces over that first breakfast. Not formally, not in any organized way, but in the sideways manner of people who are curious but unwilling to appear so. There was Hector, who was perhaps 50, and said almost nothing, but had the kind of face that was always listening. There was a young man called Denny, who was 17 and had come up from Colorado, and was deeply, visibly uncertain about almost everything except his own ability to work hard. There was Roy, who was Frank's age and had a quality to him that Evelyn recognized after about 10 minutes. The quality of a man who has decided in advance not to like something and is waiting for evidence to confirm what he's already concluded. Roy looked at her biscuits, and then at her, and then at Frank. "How long is this arrangement?" he said. Frank looked at his coffee. "Long as it needs to be." "She know anything about ranch life?" "She knows how to make food that's on the table at 6, Frank said, "which is more than we've managed in 2 months. Roy said nothing else. But he said his nothing in a way that communicated volumes, and Evelyn noted it the same way she had noted Pete's gratitude, without visible reaction, filed away, relevant to what came next. Caleb was not at breakfast. She asked Frank about it after the men had gone out, and she was stacking plates and Frank was pulling on his coat. "Caleb's usually out before light," Frank said. "He checks the fence line on the north quarter before anything else. Weather like this, you lose a section of fence, you lose cattle, and you lose cattle you might not find until spring." He paused at the door. "He'll be in for the midday meal. He'll want to know how the morning went." "How did the morning go?" she asked. Frank looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a man who is recalibrating his expectations in real time. "Better than any morning we've had since September," he said, and went out. She put Lily in the large laundry basket with a folded blanket and a wooden spoon to investigate, which bought her approximately 40 minutes of independent occupation, and she used those 40 minutes to do what she had been mentally organizing since the night before. She went through the entire kitchen systematically, moving things to where they made sense, noting what was missing, creating the kind of order that would allow her to work efficiently rather than having to rediscover where everything was every time she needed it. The pantry revealed a few things she hadn't found in the dark the night before. There was a ledger on the shelf above the preserves, a household accounts book, half filled in a hand she didn't recognize, the entry stopping abruptly in mid-September. She took it down and carried it to the kitchen table and read through it while Lily banged the wooden spoon against the side of the basket with increasing enthusiasm. The accounts were functional but sloppy. Things had been recorded but not consistently. Some entries had dates, some didn't. There were gaps of weeks where apparently nothing had been purchased or the purchases hadn't been recorded. The handwriting changed twice, suggesting that more than one person had tried to maintain it. The last entry was a list of staples with prices that didn't add up correctly. She had been keeping her father's account since she was 14 years old. She had found an error in the feed store's invoice when she was 15 that had saved her father $37, and he had not thanked her for it exactly, but he had stopped questioning whether she understood numbers. She looked at the last entry in the Black River Ranch kitchen ledger and identified the arithmetic error in under a minute. It was a small thing, but small things were how you understood larger ones. She was still at the table when Lily's basket occupation ended, and the baby pulled herself up on the edge and fell over sideways with a surprised sound that was more indignation than pain, and Evelyn picked her up and settled her on her hip and went back to reading. Caleb came in just after noon. He came in the way he did most things, directly, without announcement, with the specific efficiency of someone who has a great deal to do and has learned not to waste time on preamble. He stopped when he saw her at the table with the ledger open. He looked at Lily on her hip. He looked at the kitchen, which was visibly different from the night before. "You reorganized the kitchen," he said. "The flour was behind the salt pork," she said. "That's not an order that makes any sense." "No," he agreed. He pulled off his gloves. She realized with a start that she was still in possession of the other pair, the ones he'd given her on the platform, and hung his coat and hat. "What are you reading?" "The household accounts." She turned the ledger so he could see the last page. Whoever was doing this in September was making arithmetic errors. Not large ones, but they compound. He sat down across from her and looked at the page. He had snow in his hair that was melting, and a cut on the back of his left hand that was recent enough to still be red at the edges. He didn't look at the cut. He looked at the ledger. "How much did they compound to?" he said. "Over the last 3 months of entries I can see? About $4 and change, which doesn't sound like much, but that's only the entries that are here. There are gaps where nothing was recorded. I'd want to see what was actually purchased against what's in the pantry before I could tell you whether the gaps represent unrecorded spending or nothing was bought." Caleb looked at her. "You can do that?" "It would take me an afternoon." He was quiet for a moment. "The woman before you, Mrs. Calder, she was a good housekeeper, but she didn't have much patience for numbers." I noticed, Evelyn said without judgment. She kept everything clean, from the look of the shelves. She just wasn't comfortable with the accounting. Brigg, Thomas Brigg, the owner, he used to do the household accounts himself, Caleb said. He picked up a spoon from the table, turned it over once, set it down. When he got sick last winter, things started slipping. By spring, they'd slipped further. He passed in April, and then it was just whoever could manage whatever piece was in front of them. What about the ranch accounts? Evelyn said. The actual books, the cattle records, the finances? Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Caleb Dawson did not do things dramatically, she was learning, but she caught it. Those are in the office, he said. That's a different question. I'm not asking to see them, she said quickly. I'm asking because household and ranch accounting usually connect somewhere, and if there's slippage in one, there's often slippage in the other. He looked at her for a long moment. You've done ranch accounting before? He asked. My father had a business. I kept his books from the time I was 14. It's not the same as ranch work, but the principles are the same. Income, outgoing, what's owed, what's owned, where the gaps are. Caleb was quiet. He had a particular quality of silence, not uncomfortable, not pressured, just actual quiet, like he was actually thinking rather than assembling a response. Lily reached across Evelyn's arm toward the table and grabbed the edge of the ledger with both hands and attempted to pull it toward herself with great determination. No, Evelyn said, extracting it gently. Lily looked at her with the specific expression of a child who feels this restriction is unjust. Caleb watched this exchange with an expression that was very nearly something she could have called soft, if he had been the type. I'll leave the office unlocked, he said. If you want to take a look, no obligation. I'll look when I have time. He nodded, got up, poured coffee from the pot on the stove. Lunch? There's soup. It's been on since 8. He got a bowl without being told where they were, which meant he had been in this kitchen enough to know, and he sat back down with the soup and the coffee and ate with the same efficient economy he seemed to apply to everything, and Lily watched him with the wide, unguarded curiosity of a person who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't staring. Caleb looked back at her. Hello? He said. Lily considered this for a moment and then hid her face against Evelyn's shoulder. She's shy at first, Evelyn said. Most sensible people are, Caleb said, and went back to his soup. The first week was the hardest, and also the most clarifying. She learned the rhythms of the ranch the way she had always learned things. By watching before she acted, by asking specific questions rather than general ones, by making mistakes privately when possible and learning from them quickly. She learned that breakfast at 6 was not optional, and that the men's relationship to food was directly correlated to their relationship to their work. A bad meal in the morning produced a particular quality of silence at midday that she recognized as the silence of people who were enduring rather than functioning. She learned that Hector, who said almost nothing, was the person the other hands went to when something was actually wrong, and that Frank Oller managed people with a kind of gruff, practical fairness that she came to respect. She learned that Denny, the 17-year-old, was homesick in a way he would never admit, and that an extra biscuit placed near his plate without comment was a language he understood. She learned that Roy did not intend to accept her. It wasn't dramatic. Roy was not the kind of man who made scenes. He was too conscious of his standing among the other hands for that. But there was a consistent low-grade quality to his presence in the kitchen that she could feel even when he said nothing. A skepticism that had calcified into something harder. A particular way of not quite looking at her when she spoke that communicated that what she said was not quite reaching him. When she reorganized the supply room, he mentioned to Frank in her hearing that things had been fine where they were. When she corrected the woodpile stacking arrangement so the covered wood was accessible from the kitchen door, he mentioned to Pete, again within her hearing, that it was interesting how a city woman had opinions about woodpiles. She did not respond to either of these. She had learned early that responding to that kind of commentary only fed it, and that the most effective answer was the work itself. Consistent, competent, and impervious to commentary. But she was aware of him. She noted the specific ways he tested the edges of the space she was occupying, and she filed them away, and she did not let it show. Caleb noticed. She could tell by the way he occasionally said something to Roy in a voice too low for her to hear, and the way Roy's jaw would tighten afterward. She did not ask about these exchanges. She didn't need to. What she needed was to survive the second week, and then the third, and to get Lily through the deepening cold without the baby getting sick, and to figure out what exactly was happening in the ranch's office with the accounts that Caleb had left unlocked. She went in on a Sunday afternoon when the men were occupied with various repairs, and Lily was napping. The office was a small room off the main hallway, wood-paneled, with a large desk and a rack of cattle records and 2 ledgers that were considerably more substantial than the kitchen accounting book. She sat down and opened the first one. It took her 2 hours to understand what she was looking at. By the end of the first hour, she had confirmed that the ranch was functional, but that the records were in worse shape than the household accounts. Thomas Brigg had been meticulous in his prime. She could see that in the early years of the ledger, where every transaction was recorded with dates and notes, and the kind of careful annotation that spoke of a man who understood that a ranch's health was documented, not just felt. But the last 18 months told a different story. Entries that were missing or approximate. A feed contract that appeared to have been renewed at a higher rate than the previous one, with no note explaining why or whether anyone had negotiated. A cattle count from the previous spring that didn't reconcile with the purchase records from the winter before. By the end of the second hour, she had found something that made her stop and look at the page for a long time without moving. There was a line in the expenses from March, 3 months before Thomas Brigg died, 2 months before the spring cattle season, for a payment to a company called Sutter and Associates. It was listed simply as consulting services, with no further explanation, and the amount was substantial enough that it should have had documentation attached. It didn't. She flipped through the papers in the drawer beside the ledger and found nothing corresponding to it. She found the same line item in April, a slightly different amount, same designation, Sutter and Associates, Consulting Services. She sat back in the chair and thought about this. It was possible it was completely legitimate. Thomas Brigg could have retained an outside consultant for any number of reasons. Legal work, range assessment, water rights negotiation. None of those would necessarily require detailed notes in the ranch ledger. But it was also possible it was something else. And the fact that there was no documentation, combined with the fact that the entries had begun at exactly the point when Thomas Brigg's health was visibly failing, was the kind of combination that her father had taught her to look at twice. She closed the ledger and sat in the office for a moment longer. Then she went back to the kitchen and started the bread for the following morning. And she thought about what she had found, and she decided not to say anything yet. Not until she had read the second ledger. Not until she understood what she was looking at well enough to be certain she was right. That was how you did it. You didn't announce the error. You documented it first. You made sure. Then you spoke. The second week, Lily got a cold. It was not serious. A winter cold, the kind children got, with a runny nose and a mild fever, and the particular misery of a small person who does not understand why she feels bad and cannot communicate it except through volume. Evelyn sat up with her 2 nights running, changing the cloth on her forehead, keeping her close and warm, not sleeping. The third morning, she was at the stove at 5:30, making breakfast on approximately 3 hours of sleep spread across 2 days. And she was aware, in the way that exhaustion makes everything slightly too vivid, of how thin the margins were. She had no one to take a turn with Lily. She had no one to tell her to rest. She had the work and the baby and the specific rigid discipline she had built around both. And she got through it the same way she got through most things, by not thinking about anything beyond the next necessary action. That morning, she burned the first batch of biscuits, the first time she had burned anything since she arrived. She was pulling the pan out and looking at the damage when she heard someone behind her and turned to find Caleb there, earlier than usual, in from the fence line already, standing in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the burned biscuits. He looked at her face. "How long since you've slept?" he asked. "I sleep fine," she said. "How long?" She put the burned pan down. "Lily's been sick. She's better now. It doesn't matter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the stove and picked up the coffee pot and poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of her. "Sit down. I have to make— The men can wait 10 minutes for biscuits," he said. "Sit down." She sat down. She picked up the coffee because it was there, and because she needed it, and because she was too tired to maintain the performance of not needing it. Caleb sat across from her. He looked tired too, she noticed. He usually did in these early mornings. But today there was something additional in it, something she recognized as the specific tiredness of someone carrying more than the immediate physical demands. "Ranch is losing money," he said. Not to her exactly, or not only to her, more like he was saying it to the room, testing the shape of it. She looked at him. I know. He looked at her. I looked at the ledgers, she said. You left the office unlocked. I did, he said. He didn't seem surprised. Or rather, he seemed surprised in the specific way of someone who expected a thing to happen and is still slightly thrown when it actually does. And? The records are incomplete. There are payment entries in the last year of Thomas Briggs' life that don't have documentation. A company called Sutter and Associates. She watched his face. You know that name. Caleb turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. Once around, set it still. I know it, he said. Who are they? That's what I've been trying to find out, he said. Since Brigg died. Since I started going through those same records and found the same thing you found. He looked at her with something that was partly weariness and partly a quality she couldn't quite name. Something that looked like the relief of saying a thing out loud. There are 3 payments over 5 months. The amounts don't correspond to any service I can identify. There's no contract, no correspondence, nothing. Someone was taking money from the ranch, Evelyn said. That's what it looks like. While Thomas Brigg was ill. Yes. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind was up and the kitchen was warm, and somewhere in the small room off the kitchen, Lily was finally sleeping the deep sleep of a child whose fever had broken, and the burned biscuits were cooling on the counter, and neither of them was talking about them. Nathaniel Brigg is coming, Caleb said. Thomas's son. He's been dealing with the estate back east, but I got a letter last week. He'll be here in 6 weeks to assess whether to keep the ranch or sell. And if the accounts look the way they look, Evelyn said slowly. He'll see a ranch losing money with incomplete records and no clear explanation, Caleb said. And he'll sell it. He looked at the table. Which is his right. But it'll be wrong. The ranch isn't failing because of bad management or bad land or bad cattle. It's failing because something happened to those accounts while Brigg was too sick to watch them. Do you know who was in contact with Brigg during those months? She said. Who would have had access to the ranch accounts? A few people. His attorney in Silver Creek, a man named Harlan Sutter, who came out a couple of times in the spring, said he was a range consultant, that Brigg had hired him to assess the North Pasture for water rights. Caleb stopped. Harlan Sutter. Sutter and Associates, Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her. I knew the name connected, he said. I couldn't prove it. I'm not sure we can prove it now, she said. Not with what's in the ledger, but if there are payment records at the attorney's office, or if Sutter filed anything with the county. You know how to read a legal filing? He said. I know how to read numbers, she said. Legal language is just numbers with more words. He looked at her for a long moment. It was the look she had noticed him using occasionally, not calculating, not appraising, but genuinely seeing, in the way that was rarer than it should have been. Why are you doing this? He said. You came out here for a husband. You ended up with a job managing a ranch house that doesn't belong to you and that might be sold in 6 weeks. You don't have to care about the accounts. She thought about answering that with something practical and deflecting. She thought about saying, because I need to know whether this place is going to exist in 6 weeks, because I need to plan, because it's a problem in front of me and I don't know how not to solve problems. Instead, she said, Lily needs a home. He was quiet. Not a temporary one, she said, a real one. Somewhere that's going to be there in a year, in 5 years. I can't build that on a foundation that might give way. So yes, I care about the accounts. She picked up her coffee. I find it difficult to see something that isn't right and not try to fix it. My father said it was my worst quality. Caleb almost smiled. It was small enough that she might have imagined it. I don't think that's a bad quality, he said. You don't know me well enough to make that determination. No, he agreed. I don't. He stood up, picked up his coffee. I'll get the attorney's name. His office is in Silver Creek. If there are filing records anywhere, they'd be there. I'd need to go to town to look at them. I know. He moved toward the door. We'll figure out a day. Caleb, he paused. Don't tell the men what we're looking for, she said. Not yet. If Sutter or whoever he's connected to has people watching the ranch, I'm already not telling the men, he said. I haven't told anyone. She nodded. He went out. She made a second batch of biscuits. They were not her best work. She was too tired and her hands were slightly unsteady. But they were better than the burned ones, and she had them on the table by 6:15, which was late, and Roy looked at the clock on the wall when he came in, and then at her in a way that said he had noticed. She looked back at him and said nothing. Across the table, Pete took 2 biscuits without looking at either of them, and Denny poured his coffee and asked Hector something about the fence line, and Frank read a letter from his brother in Wyoming, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do when there's work to do, imperfectly, underweight, but forward. She refilled the coffee pot and thought about Harlan Sutter and a dying man's accounts, and the specific kind of person who waits until someone is too sick to notice and then starts helping themselves to what isn't theirs. She thought about what she was going to need to find in Silver Creek to make what she suspected into something provable. She thought about Lily, finally sleeping peacefully 20 feet away. She poured herself another coffee and started on the midday meal, and she was afraid, the way she was always afraid. Not loudly, not in a way that interfered with the work, but underneath everything, quietly, like a current in cold water, always there. The difference was that now she knew what she was afraid of, and that made it manageable. Specific fears were something she knew how to move through. She had been doing it her whole life. The trip to Silver Creek happened on a Thursday, which Evelyn noted without particular sentiment, just the awareness that Thursdays seemed to be the days when the shape of things changed on her. Caleb had arranged it without announcement. He simply appeared at the kitchen door on Wednesday evening after supper and said they would go in the morning, that Frank could manage the men for a day, that she should bring whatever she had written down from the ledgers. She had already written it down. She had been writing things down for 2 weeks, building a careful record on the back pages of a small notebook she'd found in the desk drawer. Amounts, dates, the specific language of each Sutter and Associates entry, the gaps between entries that were themselves a kind of evidence. She left Lily with Frank, which she hated, and Frank accepted this responsibility with the expression of a man confronting something genuinely outside his experience, but too proud to say so. Hector, who had appeared silently in the kitchen doorway as she was giving Frank instructions about the nap schedule, said nothing but positioned himself near the kitchen when they left, which she recognized as his version of volunteering. She did not thank him out loud. She nodded once, and he nodded back, and that was the entirety of that transaction. The road to Silver Creek in December was not a road in any sense she had previously understood the word. It was a direction, enforced by habit and wheel ruts, and the general understanding that this was where people went. Caleb drove and she sat beside him with her notebook in her coat pocket and her hands in his gloves, which she had simply kept, because every time she thought about returning them, the cold made the thought impractical, and eventually she had stopped thinking about it. "Tell me about the attorney," she said, when they were clear of the ranch buildings. "Aldous Pruitt," Caleb said. "He's handled Briggs' affairs for 15 years. He's not dishonest." A pause. "He's also not particularly alert to things he's not looking for. Meaning he might have filed things without reading them. Meaning he's a man who trusts the paperwork in front of him," Caleb said, "which is not the same as trusting the people who generated it." She thought about this. The wagon moved over a frozen rut, and she grabbed the seat edge and then let go when they were level again. "Does Pruitt know you've been looking at the accounts?" she asked. "No." "Does anyone know, besides me?" Caleb looked at the road ahead. "No." "Then we go in as... what? You're reviewing the estate accounts before Nathaniel arrives?" "That's true," Caleb said. "That's exactly what I'm doing. It doesn't require a reason beyond the obvious." He glanced at her briefly. "You're there because you manage the ranch household, and you're helping me organize the financial records." "Which is also true." "Yes." She appreciated this about him, the way he constructed situations that were defensible because they were accurate rather than invented. It was a particular kind of intelligence, the practical kind, and she had more respect for it than she sometimes admitted. Pruitt's office was on the main street of Silver Creek, above a dry goods store, reached by a staircase on the outside of the building that was icy enough to require attention. The office itself was warm, book-lined, and organized with the particular dense disorder of someone who knows exactly where everything is and has no interest in making that knowledge transferable. Aldous Pruitt was perhaps 60, with wire spectacles and the deliberate movement of a man who had decided some time ago that hurrying was for other people. He looked at Caleb without surprise, they clearly knew each other, and then at Evelyn with the mild, assessing look of someone trying to place an unfamiliar element. "This is Mrs. Hartwell," Caleb said. "She's been managing the household at Black River." "Ah," Pruitt said, as if this explained something. I heard about the arrangement. He gestured to the chairs before his desk. Sit down. What do you need? We're preparing the accounts for Nathaniel's review, Caleb said. I want to make sure everything is in order before he arrives, specifically the payment records from the last year of Thomas's life. He paused. Some entries in the ranch ledger reference outside consultants. I want to match the ledger entries to whatever documentation was filed here. Prewitt looked at him for a moment over the spectacles. That's thorough of you. Thomas kept the ranch running for 30 years, Caleb said. The least I can do is make sure his son has a clear picture when he comes. It was the right thing to say. She watched Prewitt's expression settle into something more accommodating and understood that Caleb had known it would be the right thing, had chosen it precisely. Prewitt went to the filing cabinets along the back wall and spent several minutes going through them with the focused attention of a man who does know where everything is, and produced 3 folders. He set them on the desk. The ranch's legal correspondence for the last 18 months, he said. Payment authorizations Thomas signed. Go through me, so they'll be there. Thank you, Caleb said. We'll be careful with them. Prewitt looked at Evelyn. You have a head for accounts, Mrs. Hartwell? My father ran a dry goods business in Boston, she said. I kept his books. He seemed to find this satisfactory in a vague way. I'll have my girl bring tea. He went out, and Evelyn opened the first folder before the door finished closing. The payment authorizations were in date order, signed by Thomas Brigg, countersigned by Prewitt as the authorizing attorney. Most of them were routine: feed suppliers, equipment maintenance, the wages for the hands, a property tax payment in February. She moved through them quickly, skimming, until she found the first Sutter and Associates authorization. It was dated March 14th. The amount matched what was in the ranch ledger within $1. The description: range assessment and water rights consultation, North Pasture Quadrant. Thomas Brigg's signature was at the bottom, shaky in a way the earlier signatures in the folder were not, the handwriting of a man whose hands were already failing him. She set it to the side and kept reading. The second payment was April 3rd. The third was May 2nd. Both descriptions: ongoing consultation services, range development, North Quadrant. The signature deteriorating on each one. And then, tucked between the May authorization and a routine wages record, something that was not a payment authorization at all. It was a contract. She read it once quickly, then again slowly, and then she set it flat on the desk and pressed both hands against the edge of the table, because her hands had gone slightly unsteady and she needed to do something with them. It was a contract between Thomas Brigg, property owner, and Sutter and Associates, represented by one Harlan Sutter, for the ongoing assessment and potential development rights consultation of the North Pasture Quadrant, 40 acres of Black River Ranch land, at a rate of services that translated, over the 12-month term of the contract, to nearly $400. $400. It was not the amount, though the amount was substantial. It was the clause at the bottom of the second page, above Thomas Brigg's failing signature and below Harlan Sutter's confident one. In the event of the property owner's incapacitation or death during the term of this agreement, all accumulated consultation fees become immediately due and payable from the estate, and Sutter and Associates retains a first priority claim on the assessed quadrant equivalent in value to any unpaid balance. She read it a third time to make sure she was reading it correctly. Then she turned to show it to Caleb and found him already looking at her face. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the contract without speaking. She watched him read it. He was a man who did not make a lot of noise with his reactions. She had learned that. But she saw the moment he reached the bottom clause, because the quality of his stillness changed. It became the stillness of something held in check. "He signed this in March," Caleb said. "When his hands were already shaking," Evelyn said. "When he was already sick enough that someone going over those papers with him could have guided the conversation in a direction that served them." Caleb set the contract down. He picked it up again. He read the clause once more. "This gives Sutter a claim on the North Pasture," he said, "if there's an unpaid balance at the time of death." "Yes." "How much was paid before Brigg died?" 3 payments, about $140 in total." Caleb did the arithmetic with the expression of a man who already knows the answer and is simply confirming it, leaving a balance of roughly $260, which Sutter could claim against 40 acres of the North Pasture, which is where the spring water source is, Caleb said. His voice was even, but the evenness was deliberate. That quadrant includes the main water access for the summer grazing. Without it, the ranch loses probably 30% of its viable summer range. This was not a consultation contract, Evelyn said. No, Caleb said. It wasn't. They sat with that for a moment. The tea arrived, brought by a young woman who set it down without looking at either of them and disappeared. Neither of them touched it. Did Prewitt see this? Evelyn said. He filed it. That's not the same thing. No. Caleb leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at the contract. Prewitt authorized the payments, but this contract would have come in, how does it read, as a legal services agreement. He may have taken it at face value. Or he may have been presented with it by someone who was very practiced at presenting things at face value, Evelyn said. Sutter, Caleb said. I've never met the man, she said. But the timing, the contract dates, the payment schedule beginning exactly when Brig's health was visibly declining, the clause that only activates if Brig dies or becomes incapacitated. This was planned. Whoever put this together knew what they were doing and knew what the likely outcome was going to be. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. She let him be quiet. She understood that he was working through the same calculation she had already completed, and that he needed to arrive at it himself. Nathaniel, he said finally, when he comes and reviews the estate, this contract is in the legal file. It looks legitimate. It's signed by his father. It's countersigned by the family attorney. He has no reason to question it. And Sutter submits his claim for the outstanding balance, Evelyn said, and gets 40 acres of north pasture for $260 and a contract that was designed to be signed by a dying man. She nodded. Caleb picked up the contract again and looked at the signature at the bottom. Harlan Sutter's name, written with the particular confident flow of someone who has signed documents like this before. Have you seen anything like this before? He asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. My father was approached by a man like this once, she said, when the business was struggling. The man came in as a creditor offering to restructure the debt. What he was actually doing was building a position to claim the building. She paused. My father caught it because the terms seemed generous. Genuinely predatory contracts often seem generous at first. It's only when you read the contingency clauses that you see where the teeth are, Caleb said. Yes. He set the contract down. He looked at her. What do we do with this? We make a copy, she said, as accurate as I can write it, noting the exact language of the contingency clause. We leave the original here in Prewitt's file because moving it or removing it would raise questions. And then we figure out who Harlan Sutter is and whether there are other properties where he's done this before. If there are, then there's a pattern, she said, and a pattern is something a circuit judge takes seriously. A single contract with a sick man's signature is a civil dispute. A pattern of contracts with dying or incapacitated landowners is something else. Caleb looked at her for a moment with an expression she was having increasing difficulty categorizing. It wasn't the way the men at the ranch looked at her, the various versions of tolerance or skepticism or grudging respect. It was something more direct than any of those, and it made her slightly uncomfortable in a way she chose not to examine closely. You figured this out from a ledger entry, he said. I figured out that something was wrong from the ledger entry, she corrected. The contract told me what it was. You've been here 3 weeks, he said. I'm aware of that. I've been at Black River for 4 years and I didn't... You were managing a ranch, she said. You were watching cattle and fence lines and weather and wages. You weren't looking at the accounts until after Brig died, and by then there was a great deal of other things requiring attention. It's not the same thing as not being capable of seeing it. He was quiet. Don't, she said. He looked at her. Don't make it a thing where you feel like you missed something you should have caught, she said. That's not useful. What's useful is what we do now. A pause. Then, almost to himself, you sound like someone who's told herself that a lot. She thought about Thomas dying and the rent and the ledger entries in her father's store that her father had not wanted to look at, and the ticket to Montana in the envelope from a man she had never met. Yes, she said. I have. Prewitt came back in 10 minutes later, and she was copying the contract language into her notebook in her careful, close handwriting, and he stopped in the doorway. Finding what you need? He said. There's a contract in here from March, Caleb said. From a range consultant named Harlan Sutter. Did you have much dealing with him? Prewitt came to the desk and looked at the contract. His expression moved through several small adjustments. He came in with Thomas in early March, he said slowly. Thomas had mentioned bringing someone in to assess the north pasture. There was a question about whether the spring water rights were fully documented in the property deed. Sutter presented as a range and water rights consultant. He picked up the contract, read the bottom clause, and said nothing for a moment. "Did you read this when it was filed?" Evelyn asked. Prewitt looked at her over his glasses. "The material terms were standard for a consulting arrangement," he said. "I noted the contingency clause, but—" He stopped. He set the contract down. He took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "But Thomas was already ill," Caleb said. "He was lucid in March," Prewitt said, and it came out slightly defensive, and he seemed to hear that because he set his glasses back on and straightened. "But the clause—" He read it again. "In the context of his health, I should have flagged this." "Mr. Prewitt," Evelyn said, keeping her voice neutral, "do you have any other records concerning Sutter? Any correspondence from him? Any other filings? Anything from before the March meeting?" "Not that I've filed," Prewitt said. He was looking at the contract with the expression of a man reviewing a decision he cannot reverse but wishes he could. "But I can check the correspondence box. There may be letters." He went to a second cabinet in the corner, one he hadn't opened before. He rifled through it for several minutes and produced a single letter, which he read, and then handed to Caleb without comment. The letter was from Harlan Sutter, dated February, a month before the contract. It was addressed to Thomas Brigg, care of Prewitt's office, introducing Sutter as a specialist in water rights and range assessment, referencing a mutual acquaintance named Collier, and suggesting a meeting to discuss options for securing the North Pasture water rights before the spring legal filing season. The mutual acquaintance was Edward Collier. Caleb looked up from the letter. His jaw had done the thing she had noticed it do before, a slight tightening, like something being held still by force. "Collier," he said. "You know that name," Evelyn said. "Ed Collier owns the Bar C, 3 miles north of Black River," Caleb said. "He's been trying to buy the North Pasture water rights for 5 years. Thomas Brigg refused to sell." The room was very quiet for a moment. "He found someone else to take them," Evelyn said. It was not a question, and no one treated it as one. She finished copying the contract language and wrote Collier's name in the margin of her notebook and underlined it once. Not from drama. She didn't underline things from drama. She underlined it because she wanted to make sure it was distinct from the other notes, clearly connected to the letter, a line of evidence rather than a suspicion. Prewitt made them copies of the letter. His hand was slow, and the copies took some time. And by the time they were done, the light outside was moving into the flat gray of a Montana afternoon in December, and they needed to be on the road before dark. In the wagon going back, Caleb drove, and she sat beside him with the notebook on her knee and the wind at their backs, and the specific quality of silence that comes after you have found the thing you were afraid of finding and discovered it is worse than you expected. "Collier will know we went to Prewitt's," Caleb said after a while. "How?" "Small town," he said. "Someone will mention it. Maybe Prewitt himself, just in conversation, not maliciously." "How much time do we have before Nathaniel Brigg arrives?" 4 weeks, maybe 5. "Is that enough time to find other properties where Sutter has filed similar contracts?" "The county recorder's office has deed records," Caleb said. "If Sutter's established any land claims, they'd be there. But it's in Mill Haven, 20 miles east. Can you go?" "Not without someone noticing I'm gone a full day." He paused. "Roy watches things. He's connected to Collier somehow. I don't know exactly how. They're not friendly, but Roy was at the Bar C last spring around the time all of this was starting. I noticed at the time and didn't know what to make of it." She had been wondering about Roy. She had been wondering about him since the first morning, since the way his skepticism about her had felt slightly too pointed to be purely about her being a woman from the East. "He's reporting to Collier," she said. "I don't know that." "But you think it." A pause. "I think it's possible." She turned this over. Roy watching her sort through the kitchen supplies, Roy noting when she came in late with burned biscuits, Roy at the table every morning watching Caleb's face when they spoke. "He hasn't seen the notebooks," she said. "I've kept them in the room with Lily." "Good. But if someone reports to Collier that you and I went to Prewitt's office in Silver Creek together, then Collier knows we're looking," Caleb said. "Yes." Will he move the timeline up? Try to establish the claim before Nathaniel arrives and before we can document what we've found? I don't know enough about how Sutter operates, Caleb said. But a man who designed that contract designed it to withstand scrutiny by a grieving heir reviewing an estate. He may believe the contract is bulletproof. It might be, she said. Legally, a signed contract is a signed contract. But if there are others, Caleb said, other ranchers who signed similar contracts with Sutter, then it becomes a pattern of fraud rather than a single contract, and the question shifts from whether the contract is valid to whether the consent was real. She paused. Which is a harder case to make, but not impossible. Caleb was quiet for a stretch of road. There's a man in Silver Creek, he said finally. Jess Tanner. He runs the feed store. His father had a small spread north of here. He sold it 6 years ago, but he knows everyone who owns land in this valley. If Sutter has worked this area before, Tanner would know, she said, or know someone who does. Tomorrow? Tomorrow I have a fence section down on the east side that's going to take all day, he said. The day after. All right. They came over the last rise before the ranch, and the buildings appeared in the fading light, the house with its smoke, the barn, the working shapes of things that existed because someone had built them and kept building them and refused to stop. She looked at it and felt the thing she had been feeling for 2 weeks settle more firmly, like something that had been uncertain of its footing and had now found purchase. The wagon pulled up to the back of the house, and Frank appeared in the doorway, and she knew immediately from his face that something had happened. Lily? She said. She's fine, Frank said quickly. She's asleep. It's not... He stopped. He looked at Caleb. Roy didn't come in for supper. His horse is gone. Caleb got down from the wagon. When did he leave? Denny says he saw him heading north around 3, Frank said, toward the Bar C Road. The three of them stood in the cold and looked at each other, and none of them said what all of them were thinking, because saying it out loud wouldn't change what it meant. Roy had gone to Collier. Evelyn went inside. She went to the room off the kitchen and checked on Lily, who was asleep and warm and entirely ignorant of everything, and she stood there for a moment and breathed. Then she picked up the notebook from under the edge of the cot mattress where she had hidden it before they left that morning, and she opened it to the pages she'd been working on, and she added Collier's name and the date Roy had left, and what Denny had seen. Evidence was evidence. That was the thing her father had taught her that she had never forgotten. You cannot argue with a documented fact. You can dispute an interpretation. You can challenge a conclusion. But a dated entry in a careful hand, corroborated by a witness who has no stake in the outcome, is the kind of thing that holds. She was building something that would hold. She had to. She didn't have another option. She could hear Caleb and Frank talking in the kitchen in low voices, and the sound of the fire, and outside the wind that seemed to be always present here, moving around the edges of the house with the particular Montana persistence that she was beginning to think of, not as hostile, but as simply constant, indifferent to what happened inside. Just moving, because that was what it did. She closed the notebook. She put it back under the mattress. She stood up and went to the kitchen to start the morning's bread because tomorrow was going to require everyone to be fed, and Roy being gone meant one fewer person to make breakfast for, but also one more thing to think about, and she was better at thinking when her hands were busy. Caleb was sitting at the table when she came in. Frank had gone out. Caleb had the coffee cup in his hands, and he was looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man organizing something internal that hadn't finished organizing. She went to the flour bin and measured without speaking. After a while, he said, "Thank you." She looked up. "For today," he said, "for finding what I couldn't find." He said it simply, without apparent difficulty, which was rarer in men than she often gave credit for. "I found it because I was looking for it," she said. "You would have found it eventually." "Maybe," he said, "but Nathaniel would have arrived first." He looked at his coffee. "I've been managing this ranch for 4 years, and I thought I understood it. Turns out I understood the land and the cattle and the weather. I didn't understand what was underneath the papers." "Most people don't," she said. "The people who take advantage of that count on most people not understanding." "You're not most people." She turned back to the flour because it was easier than looking at him when he said things like that. "I'm a woman who needed a job," she said, "and the job needed skills I happen to have." That's one way to look at it. She didn't ask what the other way was. She wasn't sure she wanted to know yet. There were enough variables in this situation without adding that particular one to the calculation. She worked the dough, and he sat at the table, and the fire was good, and the house was quiet except for the wind, and Lily slept 20 feet away, and somewhere north on the Bar C Road, Roy was telling Edward Collier that something had changed at Black River Ranch. She needed to move faster than Collier could respond to that. She had 4 weeks, maybe less, and a notebook of evidence that was not yet enough, and a pattern she could see but could not yet fully prove, and a man sitting at her kitchen table who had given her a coat on a frozen platform and asked nothing in return. It was not nothing to work with. She had built things from less. Roy came back the next morning. He rode in before breakfast, put his horse in the barn without speaking to anyone, and came to the kitchen table and sat down like nothing had happened, like he had simply been elsewhere and was now here again, and the specifics were nobody's business. Denny looked at Pete. Pete looked at his coffee. Frank said nothing, but his silence had a quality to it, a held-back quality, like a door that was closed but not latched. Evelyn set a plate in front of Roy the same as she set plates in front of everyone else. She did not look at him any longer than she looked at the others. She refilled the coffee pot and put it back on the stove and went to the counter and began on the midday preparations. And she was aware of Roy's presence at the table the way you are aware of a splinter. Not overwhelming, not incapacitating, but specific and impossible to fully ignore. Caleb was not at breakfast. He had been out since before 4, which was earlier than usual, and she understood without being told that he was doing something he did not want observed. When he came in at mid-morning, he came in through the front of the house rather than the kitchen, which meant he had something he wanted to tell her without an audience. She found a reason to be in the hallway. He was standing at the small table where the mail was left, going through nothing in particular with the focused attention of a man who is not actually reading what is in his hands. She stopped beside him and kept her voice low. "He's back," she said. "I saw his horse in the barn." Caleb set down the envelope he wasn't reading. "I rode the north fence line before dawn. There were tracks. 2 horses from the direction of Bar C coming in along the creek bed, not the road. Someone rode out with him last night." "Collier?" "I don't know whose tracks they were," he said, "but 2 horses came in from that direction and stopped about a quarter mile from the ranch buildings. One set of tracks went back. Roy's came in." She thought about this. They wanted to see the ranch from a distance. "Or they were delivering something," Caleb said. "Instructions. A message." "A timeline," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, that's what I think." She had been thinking, since the night before, about what Roy had told Collier and what Collier would do with it. The most dangerous interpretation was the one she kept returning to. Collier now knew that someone at Black River was looking at the Brigg estate accounts. He did not yet know exactly what had been found. Roy had no way of knowing the specifics, since she had kept the notebook in the room with Lily and Caleb had not discussed the details of the contract with anyone else. But Collier was a man who had engineered a long-term scheme to take a water source from a neighboring ranch by exploiting a dying man. He was not the kind of man who panicked, but he was the kind of man who moved when he felt pressure. "He'll try to establish the claim before Nathaniel arrives," she said. "Get Sutter to submit the outstanding balance demand through Prewitt before the estate review can happen." "If the claim is in Prewitt's hands and properly filed," Caleb said, "it becomes part of the estate that Nathaniel has to address. The north pasture goes as collateral. Unless we can show the contract was fraudulent." "We need Millhaven," he said, "the county recorder." "I know." She looked at the floor for a moment, thinking. "I can't go. I can't take Lily on a 40-mile round trip in December, and I can't leave her here right now." "I'll go," Caleb said. "Roy will notice you're gone for a full day." "Roy already knows we're looking at something," Caleb said. "Me going to Millhaven isn't going to change what Collier already suspects." He paused. "What I need is for him not to know what I find when I get there." She understood. "Go tomorrow," she said. "I'll give you a list of exactly what to look for in the recorder's office. Sutter's name, any property claims filed in the last 2 years, any contracts with contingency clauses on land in this valley. If he's done this to one ranch, he's done it to others. And if I find others?" "You bring back copies," she said, "or you write down exactly what's there. Dates, amounts, property descriptions, the names of the owners." She thought for a moment. "Prewitt," she said. "Before you go to the recorder, go to Prewitt and tell him what we think is about to happen. Tell him not to accept any filing from Sutter or anyone acting on Sutter's behalf until Nathaniel has had the opportunity to review the estate personally. Can he do that? Legally? I don't know, she said honestly, but I know that Prewitt felt badly about that contract yesterday. He's a man who doesn't like having been played, and we can use that. She paused. Not manipulate him, just remind him that there's a question about the validity of the original contract, and that filing a claim against an estate under review is something that deserves caution. Caleb was quiet for a moment, looking at the door at the end of the hallway. You're very good at this, he said. At what? At seeing what levers to move. She thought of her father's store, the creditor who had come in with the restructured debt offer. The way she had sat at the kitchen table at 16 and drawn out on a piece of paper exactly which elements of the offer served them and which served only him, and shown it to her father, who had looked at it for a long time and then said, not warmly, but with a kind of worn acknowledgement, "You're right." It's not strategy, she said. It's just looking at what's there, what's real, and working with that. Some people can't do it, he said. Some people don't have to, she said. He left for Silver Creek and Mill Haven before dawn the following morning, before Roy was up, and Evelyn told Frank he had gone to deal with a supply order, and Frank's face said he did not entirely believe this, but he accepted it, because Frank was a man who understood the difference between what he needed to know and what was better to be able to say he didn't. The day was hard in a different way than the other days had been. Harder because there was nothing to do but wait and work. And the working was the usual work. Bread, the midday meal, the ongoing project of getting the kitchen stores organized before the deep freeze settled in for good. And the waiting was underneath all of it, a current she had to keep swimming against. She checked the notebook twice. She moved it from under the mattress to the bottom of the bag she'd arrived with, beneath the spare dress she'd brought from Boston that was too light for Montana winters, which she hadn't touched since she arrived. Lily, who had been managing the kitchen's rhythms with the adaptability of a child who doesn't know the world is supposed to be otherwise, spent the morning pulling herself up on the low shelf beside the stove. Carefully, Evelyn watched from the corner of her eye, and investigating the wooden implements that she was allowed and the ones she wasn't, in a rotation that seemed to follow some internal logic of two-year-old experimentation. Hector came in mid-morning for something and crouched down, at some personal cost to his knees from the look of it, and offered Lily a smooth piece of wood he'd been working with his knife into something that might eventually be a horse. She took it and examined it with the seriousness it apparently deserved, and Hector straightened up and said nothing and got his coffee and went back out. She stored that away. The small transactions of a place were the place itself, she had learned, not the dramatic ones. Roy was trouble in a specific way that day. Not obvious. He worked his shifts, ate when he was supposed to, said what he needed to say. But twice she caught him watching the road out the north kitchen window, and once she saw him and Denny in a conversation that stopped when she appeared in the barn doorway looking for a bucket. Denny looked guilty. Roy looked at her with the flat, measuring look she had come to know, and did not look away. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Roy." She got her bucket. "Caleb's gone to town?" "Supply order," she said, and left. She told herself she had not given anything away. She had looked at him the same way she had looked at him since the first morning, and her voice had been the same, and her hands had not done anything revealing. She had learned over the last month that Roy was watching her in the way that people watch something they have already decided to discount, which meant he was also, paradoxically, less likely to catch what she was doing than someone who took her seriously. That was something, at least. Caleb came back after dark, which was later than she'd expected, and she had kept supper on the stove, and the other men had eaten and gone out or gone to bed, and Frank was in the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was quiet when Caleb came in. He looked tired. Not the usual end-of-day tired, but the specific tiredness of someone who has been in a wagon for most of the day and found things that required processing. She put food in front of him. He sat down and ate, and she sat across the table with her coffee and waited. "3," he said. She looked at him. "3 other properties," he said, "in the county recorder's office. Sutter filed claims on all 3 in the last 2 years. 1 in Grayson Valley, 1 on the Henderson spread east of Mill Haven, 1 on a small sheep operation up near the tree line." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. The notes he'd made, she saw, in his own handwriting, compressed and efficient. 2 of the 3 involved contingency clauses that activated on the owner's death or incapacity. The third was different. That one was an outright purchase, but the purchase price was later disputed by the owner's widow, who said her husband had signed under the understanding it was a loan agreement. Did she file anything? She tried. It went nowhere. No attorney, not enough documentation. He looked at the paper. Her name is Ada Morse. She lives in Mill Haven now. I went to see her. Evelyn set her coffee down. She's 72, Caleb said. She lost the property 18 months ago. 17 acres, good water. She knew Sutter's name before I said it. The moment I mentioned a consulting contract with a contingency clause, she knew exactly what I was talking about. He paused. She said when she went to the recorder to dispute the claim, a man from Collier's operation was already there. Already knew she was coming. Collier has someone in the recorder's office, Evelyn said, or someone who moves faster than she could. He rubbed his face. Either way, by the time she got a hearing, the claim was fully recorded and the deed transfer had processed. She said it was like trying to hold back water with her hands. Evelyn thought about Ada Morse going to a county office to fight for 17 acres alone at 72, without an attorney, and finding that the water was already through. Is she willing to make a statement? She said. She said yes, Caleb said. She said yes before I finished asking. Something tightened in her chest that was not quite grief, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of recognizing a person's whole situation in a single detail. Good, she said, because that was what the moment needed. That's 3 properties, 3 patterns. Combined with the Brigg contract and the letter from Collier to Sutter through Prewitt. Is that enough? He said, for a judge to look at? She thought about this carefully, the way she thought about things she was not certain of, slowly, without forcing the conclusion. Maybe, possibly. The difficulty is that all the contracts are individually signed and recorded. The fraud isn't in any single document. It's in the pattern of who's being targeted and when and by whose direction. She paused. We need Collier's connection to Sutter to be documentable. The letter that came through Prewitt's office references a mutual acquaintance, Collier, but that's Sutter referring to Collier, not Collier directing Sutter. What would show the direction? Money, she said simply. If Sutter is doing this on Collier's behalf, Collier is paying him something, either a fee or a portion of the assets acquired. She looked at the notes. The Grayson Valley property, the Henderson spread, the sheep operation. Who owns them now? Caleb looked at his paper. The first 2 were absorbed by a land company called Mountain Valley Holdings. The third, the sheep operation, went to an individual buyer I couldn't trace. He paused. Mountain Valley Holdings is registered in Helena. Is Collier connected to Mountain Valley Holdings? I don't know, he said. I couldn't find a connection at the recorder's office. The Helena registration would have more detail. She was quiet for a moment, doing the kind of arithmetic that wasn't about numbers. Nathaniel Brigg, she said. When does he arrive? I got a letter today when I stopped at the post office in Silver Creek, Caleb said. He reached into his coat again and pulled out an envelope, opened, already read. He's arriving in 11 days. 11 days. She looked at the table. 11 days was not enough time to trace Mountain Valley Holdings to Collier and Helena and get back and build the kind of documented case that would convince a circuit judge to void the Sutter contract. She knew that. But 11 days might be enough to put what they had in front of Nathaniel Brigg in a form that was organized and clear and convincing enough to buy more time, to convince him not to accept the estate as presented, to question the Sutter contract before he signed anything. Prewitt, she said. What did he say? He agreed not to accept any new filings related to the estate until after Nathaniel's review, Caleb said. He wasn't happy about it. He kept saying the contract was signed and filed and legally he wasn't sure of his ground. But he agreed. He agreed, Caleb said. He also said, and this surprised me, that he'd had a visit this morning from a man he didn't recognize who asked questions about the status of the Brigg estate and specifically about whether any claims had been filed against the North Pasture. Evelyn looked up. This morning, while you were in Mill Haven. While I was in Mill Haven. His voice was even, but she could hear what was underneath it. Sutter, or someone working for him. They're moving, she said. Yes. They sat in the quiet kitchen and she thought about timelines and the specific way that schemes like this one were designed to work. Not with force, but with timing, with bureaucratic momentum, with the understanding that by the time someone recognized what was happening, the paperwork would already be complete, and the legal threshold for challenging it would be almost impossibly high. She thought about Gerald Fitch selling his ranch and going south with whatever he'd gotten from it, while she was on a train heading toward a promise that no longer existed. She thought about the difference between the kind of person who made their living by seeing what people needed to believe and selling it to them, and the kind of person who built things out of what was actually there. She had always been the second kind, even when it had cost her, even when the first kind looked like it was winning. "Tell me about Nathaniel Brigg," she said. Caleb considered. "I've met him twice, both times briefly. He was out here 3 years ago with his father for about 2 weeks. He's not like Thomas. Thomas was a man of this land, built for it. Nathaniel went east for school when he was 16 and didn't come back much. He's not a rancher. He's a businessman. He looks at things in terms of—" He stopped, searching for the word. "Numbers," she said. "Value," he said. "He looks at things in terms of what they're worth and whether it makes sense to hold them. So if the ranch looks like a liability, he sells it," Caleb said. "That's my honest assessment. He's not a cruel man, I don't think, but he doesn't have any particular attachment to Black River. And a ranch that's losing money with unclear accounts, and a legal claim on its water source is a ranch that's going to look, to a businessman, like a problem he didn't create and doesn't want." She nodded slowly. "Then what we're presenting to him isn't just a fraud case," she said. "It's a business case. The ranch isn't failing because the ranch is bad. The ranch is failing because someone has been systematically draining it and creating a legal trap designed to force a sale. Yes. And if the trap is exposed, the ranch is worth holding," Caleb said. "More than that," she said. "If the claim on the North Pasture is voided and the fraud is documented, Black River potentially has a legal claim against Collier and Sutter for the damages, which is an asset, not just a removed liability." Caleb looked at her. "I'm not inventing that," she said. "That's what the pattern of evidence suggests. 3 other properties, 1 disputed widow, a documented scheme that appears to have been organized and funded by Collier. If Nathaniel Brigg has a good attorney—" "Prewitt," Caleb said, and then paused. "Or someone better." "Someone from Helena, maybe," she said. "Someone who knows how to trace a land company registration." He was quiet for a long moment. He had finished eating, and the plate was pushed aside, and he was looking at the table in the way he looked at things he was processing. "When I came here 4 years ago," he said, "Thomas Brigg gave me a job the same way I gave you one. I had no particular recommendation. I'd come through a hard few years, and he saw something he thought was useful, and he offered it without making a production of it." He paused. "He built this place over 30 years. He buried his wife here. He raised a son here, even if that son went east and didn't come back much." Another pause. "What Collier and Sutter did to him while he was dying, that's not just a legal wrong. It's a particular kind of cruelty. The kind that waits for a person to be too weak to fight and then helps itself." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know. I know you know," he said. "I just—" He stopped, looked at the table. I wanted to say it out loud." "Then it's said," she told him. He nodded. She began organizing the notes they had. Her notebook, his paper from the recorder's office, the copies of Prewitt's documents that Caleb had brought back, into a sequence that told the story clearly. Not dramatically. Not in the way of someone trying to persuade an audience. In the way of someone laying out facts in an order that made their meaning unavoidable. She worked at the table until nearly midnight, and Caleb sat across from her for a while and then moved to the other chair by the stove. And at some point she looked up and he was asleep, which she noted with the distant, practical part of her mind that tracked such things. The man had been in a wagon since before dawn, and she let him sleep and went on working. The next 9 days were their own kind of marathon. Caleb rode to Millhaven again on the 4th day, this time to see Ada Morse and collect a written statement from her. She had it ready when he arrived, which told him she had been ready to give it for some time and had simply been waiting for someone to ask. He brought it back on the 5th day, and Evelyn read it twice and then filed it carefully at the bottom of the bag with the other papers. Frank noticed that something was happening. I was too observant not to, and he knew Caleb too well to believe the supply order explanation was still operative. He came to Evelyn on the 6th day, in the kitchen in the early evening when the others were out, and stood in the doorway in a way that said he was waiting to be either included or explicitly excluded. She looked at him for a moment and made a decision. "Sit down, Frank," she said. She told him the relevant parts. Not everything, not Ada Morse, not the full extent of what she thought Collier had done, but the core of it, the Sutter contract, the contingency clause, the pattern of similar contracts in the county, Collier's letter to Sutter through Prewitt's office. She told him what was at stake when Nathaniel Brigg arrived. Frank listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was how he dealt with information he was taking seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Roy," he said. "Yes." "You think he told Collier what you found?" "He told Collier that something was being looked at," she said. "I don't think he could have told him specifics because he didn't have them." Frank looked at his hands on the table. "I've known Roy 4 years," he said. "He's a decent hand, works hard, but he's a man who resents things, resents people who have what he doesn't, resents being on the wrong side of a situation. Collier probably didn't have to do much to bring him in." He paused. "What do you need from me?" She had thought about this. "When Nathaniel arrives, he'll want to speak with you. You've been managing the hands through all of this. Your account of how the ranch has functioned, what's been working, what hasn't, what the men can do. That matters. But more than that, I need you to keep things stable in the bunkhouse for the next few days. If Roy is going to cause a problem, I'd rather know about it before Nathaniel gets here than during." Frank nodded slowly. "I can do that." He looked at her. "You've been here 6 weeks." "Yes." "You came here as a mail-order bride who got left on a platform," he said. "It was not unkind. It was just the fact of it." "Yes," she said. "And now you're, He gestured at the papers on the edge of the table. "Trying to keep this ranch from being stolen," she said. "Yes." He almost smiled. "Thomas Brigg would have liked you," he said. "He liked people who didn't make a lot of noise about what they were doing." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything, and Frank got up and refilled his coffee and went back to the bunkhouse. And she sat at the table for a moment with the papers in front of her and the fire behind her and Lily sleeping in the small room, and she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that might have been called satisfaction. Not triumph, not certainty, just the quiet recognition of having moved things in the right direction. And then she went back to work. On the 8th day, Harlan Sutter rode onto the ranch. She saw him from the kitchen window, a man she had never seen before but recognized immediately by the way he moved, the way he assessed the property as he rode in, the specific alertness of someone arriving at a place they have already decided belongs to them. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed for a working ranch visit, with the kind of face that arranged itself into pleasantness, the way a tool arranges itself into a purpose. He asked for Caleb. She heard Frank telling him Caleb was out on the range and asking his business. "Consulting business," Sutter said, "regarding the Brigg estate." He'd come to review the North Pasture assessment documents he had on file. He had come to the ranch, she understood, because his contact in the area had told him someone was looking at the accounts, and he wanted to understand what had been found and how close they were to the problem. He was not panicking, he was investigating. He was the kind of man who went toward problems rather than away from them, because going toward them let you shape the narrative before someone else did. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front of the house. "Mr. Sutter," she said. He turned, looked at her, reassessed, quickly. The way men like him always reassessed women they hadn't expected to find in a position of any relevance. "Ma'am?" "I'm Mrs. Hartwell. I manage the household." She kept her voice easy, neutral. "Mr. Dawson isn't expected back until late this afternoon. Is there something I can help you with?" "I don't think so," he said pleasantly. "I have some assessment documents related to the North Pasture consultation. I'm hoping to have them in order before the estate heir's visit." "Of course," she said. "Any documents related to the estate review should go through Mr. Prewitt's office." She paused. "I believe Mr. Dawson has already been in contact with Mr. Prewitt about the review process. They've worked out a protocol for the incoming documentation." Something moved behind Sutter's eyes. Very small, very controlled, but there. "A protocol," he said. "Yes. I understand it's quite thorough." She smiled pleasantly. Given the complexity of the estate, he looked at her for a moment. Just a beat too long, in the way that men underestimating a situation sometimes look when they're recalibrating. Then he smiled back, the arranged pleasantness reasserting itself. Of course, he said. I'll contact Prewitt directly. I'm sure he'll be expecting to hear from you, she said. He left. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a moment and breathed carefully, and then started the midday meal, because her hands needed something to do and the meal still needed to be made. When Caleb came in that afternoon, she told him what had happened, and he listened without expression and then said, "You didn't give him anything." "Nothing he didn't already have," she said. "You let him know we'd talked to Prewitt about a protocol." "Yes." "So he knows we're more organized than he thought." "He needed to know that," she said. "Not so he'd run. I don't think he'll run. He's too committed to the claim. But so he'd understand that arriving here and charming the household staff was not going to produce what he was hoping for." She paused. "Men like that do their best work when no one knows they're there. I wanted him to know we know." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's a risk," he said. "If he decides to move faster." "He was already moving as fast as he could," she said. "Coming to the ranch directly was a sign of pressure, not confidence. We're ahead of him. Not far enough, but ahead." 3 days later, Nathaniel Brigg arrived. He came by wagon from Silver Creek earlier in the day than they'd expected. He'd caught a faster connection than his letter had indicated, or decided to push the journey. It was younger than she'd pictured from Caleb's description, or looked younger, somewhere around 30, with his father's height and a face that had not been outdoors enough to have weather in it yet. He dressed like an Eastern businessman, which in this context stood out in the specific way that appropriate clothing in the wrong setting always does. Not wrong, but conspicuous. He shook Caleb's hand and looked around the ranch with the expression of a man taking inventory. He was polite. He was not warm, but he was not cold either. He was measured, and she understood that measured was probably how he survived in whatever business world he occupied, where warmth cost things and precision was the currency. He looked at Evelyn when Caleb introduced her with an expression she knew, the rapid calculation of who this person is and what role she plays, and shook her hand and said he was grateful for the management she had been providing. "Your father's household was well established," she said. "I had a good foundation to work from." "The accounts," he said. "Caleb mentioned you've been doing a review." "Yes," she said. "Perhaps after you've settled from the journey, we could sit down. There are some things I'd like to walk you through." He looked at her. Something in her tone, she supposed, communicated that this was not a routine accounting summary. "Tonight?" he said. "Tonight," she agreed. They sat at the dining room table after supper, the three of them, with the papers laid out in the order she had organized them over the last 9 days, each document in its place in the sequence, the account ledger pages with her notations, the copied contract language, the Prewitt copies, Caleb's notes from the county recorder, Ada Morse's written statement. She had thought about how to begin this for several days, and she had decided that beginning with the simple fact was better than building to it. "There is a contract in your father's estate files," she said, "that was designed to transfer a portion of this ranch's water access to a third party. It was signed by your father 3 months before his death, while his health was already significantly compromised. The contract is structured so that the outstanding balance becomes a first priority claim on the North Pasture." Nathaniel looked at the copied contract language she placed in front of him. He read it with the focused speed of someone who reads documents for a living. He read the contingency clause twice. "Who is Harlan Sutter?" he said. "A man who has done this to at least 3 other properties in this county," she said, and placed the recorder's notes beside the contract. "In each case, he entered as a consultant, established a services agreement with a contingency clause, and then submitted his claim shortly after the property owner's death or incapacitation." Nathaniel read the notes. He read them the way he'd read the contract, quickly and thoroughly, without visible emotional response, but she could see him building something internal, connecting points. "And his connection to Edward Collier," she said, placing the Prewitt letter last. "This is correspondence from Sutter to your father, delivered through your father's attorney. The mutual acquaintance he references is Collier, who owns the bar C to your north and has made repeated documented offers to purchase the North Pasture water rights, all of which your father refused." Nathaniel looked at the letter for a long time. The fire was going, and the kitchen sounds had stopped, and outside the Montana night was doing what it always did, pressing in, cold and complete, not hostile, just present. Lily was asleep in the small room, Frank was in the bunkhouse. The ranch was quiet around them. "This is well organized," Nathaniel said. He was looking at the papers rather than at her. "I've tried to make it clear," she said. He looked up then. "How long have you been here?" 6 weeks, she said. He looked at Caleb, who said nothing, and then back at her. "And you found all of this in 6 weeks?" "I found the ledger entries in the first week," she said. "The rest took time." She paused. "I had a reason to look carefully. This ranch is where my daughter and I live." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, she was beginning to see, but genuinely. A recognition of something he hadn't accounted for. "What are you recommending I do?" he said. She had thought about how to answer this too. "That's not my decision to make," she said. "What I can tell you is what the documents show. The Sutter contract appears to have been obtained through a process designed to exploit your father's failing health and his inability to scrutinize the terms carefully. There are similar contracts on record affecting other properties in this county that suggest a pattern rather than a single incident. A circuit court judge or a Helena attorney with experience in land fraud would be better positioned than I am to tell you what remedies are available." "But your assessment," he said. "Your honest assessment." She held his gaze. "My honest assessment is that your father built this ranch for 30 years, and someone decided to help themselves to part of it while he was dying, and I think that deserves to be challenged." She paused. "I also think Black River is a functioning ranch with good land and good people running it, and that what looks like financial trouble in the accounts is largely the result of what's been done to those accounts, rather than the underlying reality of the property. But you should reach that conclusion yourself. From the numbers, not from my telling you." Nathaniel Brigg looked at the papers on the table for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to need a good attorney." Caleb shifted beside her. "Helena," he said, "I have a name." "I'll need a few days to read through everything myself," Nathaniel said. He began gathering the papers with the careful precision of someone who treats documents as what they are, the record of things that actually happened. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Pruitt as well." "He's expecting you," Caleb said. "He has some things to say about this that I think you should hear from him directly." Nathaniel nodded. He stood. He was taller than she'd registered when he arrived, or maybe just more present now. The room had changed in the last 2 hours, the inventory-taking quality of his earlier manner replaced by something more engaged, more like someone who has found a problem he intends to address. He looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Brigg." "Thank you," he said. "Not just for tonight, for—" He gestured slightly at the organized papers in his hands, the months of work they represented. "This." She nodded once. She did not say it was nothing, because it wasn't. She did not say she was glad to, because glad was not quite the right word for what she had been while doing it. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, and because Lily needed ground that would hold, and that was enough of an explanation. After he went upstairs, she cleared the table, and Caleb stayed and helped her without being asked, stacking the cups and taking them to the kitchen, and they worked in companionable quiet for a few minutes. "He's going to keep the ranch," Caleb said. "I think so," she said. She was not entirely certain. Nathaniel was a measured man, and measured men sometimes measured their way to unexpected conclusions. But there was something in how he had gathered those papers that told her he was not holding them on his way to the door. He was holding them on his way to a fight. "And Collier," Caleb said. "We'll have to find another way to get the water rights," she said. "If there ever was a legal way, which I doubt." She washed the cups. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the wind was down for once. One of those occasional Montana nights when the cold was present but still, and the quiet of it was its own kind of weather. "Evelyn," Caleb said. She turned. He was standing near the table, not close, with the expression he sometimes had when he was about to say something he had organized carefully and wanted to deliver without its going wrong. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it before things get complicated, before attorneys and judges and whatever comes next." She waited. "When I found you on that platform," he said, "I brought you here because it was the practical thing to do. That's the truth of it. I needed someone to manage the house, and you were stranded, and it solved 2 problems." He paused. "That's how it started." "I know," she said. "What I want to say is that it's not how it is now," he said. "What it is now is something I don't have a very clean way of describing, but He stopped, started again. "You are the most capable person I have ever watched work," he said, "and I have watched a lot of people work. And what I feel when I watch you is not what you feel watching someone who is capable. It's something different." He looked at the table briefly, then back at her. "I thought you should know that." She stood in the kitchen with the cup in her hand and the warm quiet around her and thought about Thomas, and about the platform in the cold, and about Gerald Fitch, who had sent her west in good faith toward nothing, and about the notebook under the mattress and the bread every morning and Lily in the laundry basket with the wooden spoon. "I know," she said again. Because she did. She had known for some time and had not let herself examine it, the way you sometimes don't examine things you're afraid to find have become important. "That's all I wanted to say," he said. "All right," she said. He went to the back door. He paused with his hand on it. "Lily's going to want to learn to ride in the spring," he said. "Hector's been whittling her that horse for 6 weeks. It'll be done by April." She almost laughed. She came very close. "Good night, Caleb," she said. "Good night," he said, and went out into the still Montana cold. She finished the cups and put out the kitchen lamp and stood for a moment in the dark, warm room with everything that was still uncertain ahead of her. The attorney and the judge and Collier and whatever Sutter did next. And everything that was solid beneath her. It was not what she had come west for. It was better. The attorney from Helena arrived on a Wednesday. His name was Douglas Hare, and he came recommended by a judge Nathaniel knew from his Eastern business dealings, a circuit court judge who had apparently said, when Nathaniel described the situation over telegraph, that if half of what the document suggested was accurate, he wanted Hare on it. Hare was perhaps 45, thin, with the kind of economical precision in his movements that suggested a man who had learned to waste nothing, including time. He read through the entire documentation package in one sitting at the dining room table, asking 3 questions, none of which were about anything Evelyn had overlooked. The third question was directed at her. "You found the original ledger discrepancy in the first week," he said. It was not quite a question. "The entries didn't reconcile," she said, "and you had no legal training." "No." He looked at her over the papers with the specific expression of someone updating an internal assessment. "Your notes are the clearest documentation in this package," he said. "I want you to know that before we proceed because I'm going to be relying on them." She nodded and said nothing because there was nothing to add. Hare spent 2 days at the ranch reviewing everything, and then went to Silver Creek to meet with Prewitt, and then sent a telegraph to a colleague in Helena to begin tracing Mountain Valley Holdings. It took that colleague 4 days to find what they needed. Mountain Valley Holdings was registered to a man named Bernard Sutter, Harlan Sutter's brother, with a secondary registered interest held by an investment partnership that included, among its members, one Edward Collier of Silver Creek, Montana Territory. When Hare came back with that information and laid it on the dining room table, Nathaniel Brigg read it once and said, in a voice that was very controlled, "How many properties did they take?" "We've confirmed 5 in this county," Hare said. "There may be others. That's a question for the circuit court to pursue with broader discovery." "And what can we do for the ones who've already lost their land?" Hare looked at him. "That depends on the court and the evidence in each individual case," he said carefully. "I can't promise anything for those situations. What I can focus on right now is this estate and this contract." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window that faced north, toward the Bar C, toward Collier's land. "Do it," he said. The filing happened the following week. Hare filed in the Territorial Circuit Court a challenge to the Sutter contract on the grounds of predatory contracting, fraud in the inducement, and exploitation of a mentally compromised signatory. Thomas Brigg's declining health in the final months of his life, being documentable through the physician's records that Hare had obtained from Silver Creek's doctor, who had treated Brigg through the winter and spring and whose notes were more useful than anyone had known. Collier, when he was served notice of the filing, did what Evelyn had expected him to do. He denied everything. His connection to Mountain Valley Holdings was, his own attorney argued, a passive investment that he had no active role in managing. His correspondence with Sutter, filtered through Prewitt's office, was a friendly referral to a business contact, nothing more. Harlan Sutter, when served, did something no one had fully anticipated. He disappeared. Not dramatically. Not overnight bags and a running horse. He simply became very difficult to locate. His office address in Helena turned out to be a mail drop. His supposed residence in Bozeman was a rooming house where he had not been seen in 2 weeks. He had, in the language of men who do this kind of thing and have planned for the moment they might need to, arranged for the possibility of not being findable. Hare was not particularly surprised. "He's done this before," he said. "Not necessarily in this territory, but men with his pattern of operation always have an exit prepared." He paused. "The good news is that his disappearance makes the case against the contract considerably stronger, not weaker. Innocent consultants don't flee." He was right about that. The circuit court judge, a man named Averill, who had seen enough frontier land disputes to recognize the shape of this one quickly, looked at the documentation, looked at Ada Morse's statement, looked at the 5 confirmed properties, looked at the Collier connection, and voided the Sutter contract within 3 weeks of the filing. He voided it on the grounds that the contract had been obtained through fraud, that the signatory had been in a state of cognitive and physical decline that rendered meaningful consent questionable, and that the pattern of similar contracts bearing the same structural features across multiple properties in the same county constituted evidence of a deliberate scheme rather than individual business dealings. He also referred the matter to the Territorial Attorney General for further investigation of both Harlan Sutter and Edward Collier. Evelyn heard about the ruling on a Friday afternoon from Caleb, who had ridden to Silver Creek for the Post and come back with Hare's letter and Nathaniel's telegraph summary and read both on horseback on the way home because he could not wait until he arrived. He came into the kitchen and put the letters on the table in front of her and said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. His face said it, in the specific way that faces do when the thing you have been fighting for has finally yielded. She read both letters. She read them twice. Then she set them down and looked at the table and sat very still for a moment. She was not a person who cried easily. She had not cried when she arrived on the platform in the cold, not when Gerald Fitch's absence clarified itself into the permanent absence it was, not when Lily's fever had peaked at 2 in the morning and she had sat alone in the dark holding the child and not known how afraid to be. She had learned to keep the thing inside until later, until the crisis was past, because crises didn't pause for grief. But sitting in the kitchen on a Friday afternoon in February with the ruling in her hands and Lily at her feet lining up dried beans in some pattern that mattered enormously to 2-year-old logic, she felt the accumulated weight of the last 3 months press up against the back of her eyes, and she let it stay there for one long breath and then breathed it back down. Caleb sat across from her. He had taken off his hat and was turning it slowly on the table, the same gesture she'd noticed him use when he was not sure what to do with his hands. He watched her read and did not say anything until she looked up. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. Lily looked up from her beans at the sound of their voices, and then, deciding nothing required her intervention, went back to her work. It was not, in the event, entirely done. Those things never are, not with the loose ends that a case like this trails behind it. Collier did not face criminal charges. The Territorial Attorney General investigated and found the connection between Collier and Mountain Valley Holdings suggestive but insufficiently direct to prosecute. Collier's attorney argued effectively that a passive investment stake in a company, one of whose officers committed fraud, was not itself criminal, and that argument was annoying and not entirely wrong. Collier kept the bar seat. He kept his water. He lost the North Pasture claim. And he lost whatever leverage he'd been building through Sutter's operation, and he lost the quiet assumption he had apparently operated under for some time that the land around him could be quietly absorbed without consequences. He did not go to prison. He did not lose everything. He was diminished, and he was watched, and the Territorial Attorney General's investigation created a record that attached to his name in county files, and in the practical economy of a frontier community, that was a significant thing. Ada Morse's case was reopened. It was a harder fight. Her contract was older, the circumstances more complicated, the paper trail less clean. Hare took it anyway, at Nathaniel's specific request, and at a rate that Nathaniel subsidized. The court did not give her the 17 acres back. The deed transfer had been too cleanly processed and too much time had passed. What she received instead was a damages settlement that, while not equivalent to the land, was enough to buy a small house in Millhaven and have something left over. She sent a letter to Evelyn through Hare's office, written in the careful handwriting of a woman who had once been a farmer's wife and had retained the habits of careful documentation. The letter said, among other things, "I did not expect justice. I expected to be believed. That was the harder thing to find, and I am grateful for it. Evelyn kept the letter. She kept it in the same bag that had held the notebook and the Boston dress. And she kept the bag for the same reason people keep the containers that held important things. Not because the container was valuable, but because it was connected to what had been inside it. Roy left the ranch in January, 2 weeks before the court ruling. He did not announce his departure. He simply was not there one morning, his bunk cleared and his horse gone, and a note left for Frank that said only that he was going south and appreciated the work. Frank read the note and said nothing and went out. No one talked about it, and no one needed to. The space Roy left was filled within a week by a hand named Cord, who came up from Wyoming and who had the specific quality of quiet competence that Hector recognized and approved of, which was recommendation enough. Denny stayed. He stopped being homesick sometime around February, or stopped showing it, which in a 17-year-old amounted to roughly the same thing. He learned to make biscuits, not to Evelyn's standard, but functional biscuits, which was the point, because she had started teaching him simple kitchen work on the grounds that a man who could feed himself was a man with one fewer potential crisis. I was resistant to this instruction for approximately 3 days and then quietly grateful for it, in the way young people are grateful for things they pretended not to want. Nathaniel Brigg went back east in March, after signing a partnership agreement with Caleb that gave Caleb a 20% stake in Black River Ranch, in exchange for continuing to manage it and for a modest payment over 3 years. It was not what Caleb would have designed if he'd been designing it. 20% was not majority, and the payment terms were tight. But it was real, and it was documented, and it had Nathaniel's signature on it, not a dying man's. Nathaniel shook Evelyn's hand when he left and said he expected the accounts would be in better order than any his father had kept. She told him she would do what she could. He almost smiled at that. The spring came the way spring comes in Montana. Not gently, not all at once, but in contested stages. The cold refusing to fully yield until someday in late April, when you stepped outside and realized the quality of the air had changed, that the light had a different angle to it, that the mud under your feet was the kind of mud that comes from thawing, rather than the kind that comes from cold rain. Hector finished the wooden horse in April, as he had told Caleb he would. He brought it to the kitchen on a morning when Lily was at the table eating breakfast, and he set it in front of her without comment or ceremony, and Lily looked at it for a long moment. It was a good horse, smooth and carefully shaped, with a mane that Hector had incised in careful lines with his knife. And then she picked it up and held it against her chest with both arms and said, in the particular satisfied tone of a 2-year-old who has received exactly the right thing, "Mine." Hector looked at Evelyn and nodded once and went back out. She stood at the stove and watched her daughter hold the wooden horse and felt the thing she had been feeling for some time now settle into something she could name. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness had always seemed too simple a word for something that complicated, that came with so many other things attached to it. More like rightness. The specific earned sense of being in a place that had not been given to her, but that she had made, through work and attention, and the particular kind of stubbornness that refuses to mistake difficulty for impossibility. She had come west believing she was buying safety for her daughter with the last thing she had to offer, herself, her capability, her willingness to be a wife to a stranger. She had arrived to find that the stranger was gone, and the safety was an illusion, and there was nothing, no floor under her, nothing to hold. What she had not known then was that the floor had always been there. She had simply not recognized that she was the one building it, and always had been. Caleb asked her to marry him in May, on a Sunday evening, in the kitchen, which was the room where most of the things that mattered had happened between them. He did not do it with any particular drama. He asked the way he did things, directly, without preamble, with the specific seriousness of a man who has considered something carefully and is now doing the thing he has decided to do. He said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for 3 months. I don't think there's a better way than just saying it. Will you marry me?" She said, "That's not a question." He considered this. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. He looked slightly surprised, which she found she appreciated about him. That he had been prepared for a more complicated answer, had not assumed, had left room for her to be something other than what he hoped. That was, she had learned over the winter, simply how he was. He did not assume. He offered, and he waited, and he accepted the answer as it came. They were married in June, in Silver Creek, in the small civic office where the justice of the peace kept irregular hours and had the tolerant efficiency of a man who had married a great many people in frontier circumstances. Frank was there, and Hector, and Denny, who wore a clean shirt and looked like he was not sure whether to be pleased or embarrassed, and settled for both. Lily wore the dress Evelyn had made from cloth she'd traded for in Silver Creek in March, and spent the ceremony investigating the justice of the peace's boots with the focused curiosity of a person for whom the ceremony was relevant, but the boots were more immediately interesting. It was not a grand wedding. There was no music, no flowers, no dinner afterward of any particular elegance. There was coffee at the hotel dining room and biscuits that were not as good as Evelyn's, and a piece of cake that was brought out by the hotel cook without explanation, which Hector ate 2 pieces of in silence. Frank made a toast that consisted of raising his cup and saying "good," and sitting back down, which Evelyn thought was the most accurate toast she had ever witnessed. Caleb held her hand on the ride back to the ranch, which was unusual enough that she noted it, and which she did not mention, and which she was aware of all the way home. There are things that people need you to believe about stories like this one: that the triumph was clean, that the right people got everything that was coming to them, that the love arrived without complication and settled everything neatly into place. But the truth of it is rougher than that, and rougher is more honest, and honest is what it deserves. Collier was still 3 miles north on his own land. He was diminished and watched and marked, but he was there. The Attorney General's investigation would go on for another year and produce a report that recommended further action and then ran into the friction of territorial politics and the specific indifference of systems toward the people most harmed by their failures. Ada Morse had a house in Millhaven, but she did not have her land. The Henderson family and the Grayson Valley rancher, whose properties had been taken, were still in the slow process of civil suits that might or might not produce anything useful. The law moves the way large things move, with enormous force and at its own pace and not always in the direction of the people who need it most. But Harlan Sutter's contract on Black River Ranch was voided. The north pasture and its water source remained part of the property. Nathaniel Brigg had a stake in it and a partner he trusted to manage it, and the accounts were now kept in a hand that did not make arithmetic errors and did not leave gaps in the records, and could be read by any judge in any court in the territory without producing questions that couldn't be answered. And Evelyn Hartwell, Evelyn Dawson now, though she sometimes still thought of herself by the first name because it was the name she had built things under, woke up most mornings before the rest of the house and stood in the kitchen in the dark for a few minutes before starting the fire, and she thought about the platform. She thought about it not with grief, which it didn't deserve, and not with bitterness, which cost more than it returned, but with the specific clear-eyed recognition of someone who has learned something important from a hard thing and is trying to keep that learning visible. What she had found in that moment on the platform, in the specific helplessness of it, the cold, the absent man, the child against her chest, was not a rescue. She had not been rescued. What had happened was that she had seen, in a place where there was nothing else to look at, what she actually was. Not what she was afraid she was. Not what she hoped she might become. What she actually, in fact, already was. A woman who looked at problems until she understood them. A woman who built things. A woman who kept records and made bread and corrected arithmetic errors and got up at 5 in the morning and did what needed doing, not because someone was watching and not because she expected to be credited for it, but because the work was real and the stakes were real and her daughter was 20 feet away, and that was enough. She had come west looking for someone to stand between her and the world. She had found, on a frozen platform in November, that there was nobody. And from that absence, she had built something that turned out to be sturdier than anything she had been looking for. Caleb had not saved her. She wanted to be clear about that, in her own accounting of things, because he deserved accuracy more than he deserved mythology. What Caleb had done was offer a coat and a job and a door that opened rather than one that stayed closed, and then he had stepped back and let her walk through it herself, and he had watched what she did without deciding in advance what it meant. And eventually he had said, in the plain, direct way he said things, that what he saw when he watched her was not something he could be indifferent to. That was what he had offered. Not rescue. Witness. It turned out that was the harder thing to find. Lily learned to ride in the fall of that year, at 2.5, on a horse so old and patient that it seemed to have been specifically designed by time itself for the purpose of carrying small children who did not yet know how to be afraid of height. Hector led the horse in circles around the pen with Lily on its back, and she held the mane with both hands and looked around at the world from her new elevation with an expression of complete satisfaction that Evelyn watched from the fence rail and filed away in the part of herself where she kept the things she did not want to forget. Caleb stood beside her at the rail, and they watched their daughter, his, now, by choice and by legal document, and by every morning that had accumulated between November and this October afternoon. And he said nothing, and she said nothing, and the horse went around the pen and Hector said something quiet, and Lily laughed, and the sound of it crossed the distance between them like something thrown and caught. This is what she had learned and what she carried and what she would later try to give her daughter in the way that you give children things. Not directly, not as instruction, but sideways, through watching and through doing and through the specific shape of a life lived in a certain way. That the worst moments, the platform, the cold, the nothing under your feet, are not the end of the story. They are the moment the story actually starts. The moment everything you thought you were relying on has been removed and you find out what was underneath it all along. And that the people worth holding on to are not the ones who show up to carry you. They are the ones who show up, offer you a coat, and then stand back and watch you walk. She had been the woman left on this platform. She had been the woman everyone expected to fail. She had been the woman in the kitchen in the dark, building something no one had asked her to build because her daughter was 20 feet away and the work was real and it needed to be done. She was all of those things still. She did not stop being them when the contract was voided, or when the justice of the peace said the words, or when Lily put her arms around her and said, "Mama," in the specific possessive way of a child who knows exactly who she is. You do not stop being what you've built yourself into. You carry it. You carry it into this kitchen at 5 in the morning, and into the account ledgers, and into the conversations where someone is trying to take what isn't theirs, and you carry it to the fence rail on an October afternoon where the light is going gold over the Montana hills, and your daughter is learning that height is not something to fear if you know how to sit. Evelyn Dawson leaned on the fence rail and watched, and the horse went around. And the light held, the way good light does, longer than you expect, longer than it has any right to, as if it knows something about the people watching that they have not quite told them.
You're a bit tired? Yeah. You know what? I was tired earlier, but now I'm not. My sleep schedule was thrown off on Saturday night because I was in a lot of pain because of stupid trapped gas. But I'm better now. I'm doing much better now, thankfully. So working on an Ami of my Star Wars RPG character. Ooh, Cranston, that sounds awesome. Fuck yeah.